Heated debate over UK government's changes to inheritance tax on farms. Welcome to Rix Europe, Fred Defossard, Director of Strategy at Legatum Institute.
Good morning, Rebecca. Great to see you again.
Good morning and welcome back, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So could you first of all just tell us about these changes? What is the big controversy?
So, a few weeks ago, the Labour government did their first budget after winning the general election in July. This budget has increased taxes quite significantly and increased public spending even more significantly and will likely require more borrowing. So it's pretty bad across the board. The two main tax rises they have introduced is national insurance, so a tax on all payrolls, and also the agricultural property relief exemption has come to an end. That, in a long way of saying, is that they have ended the exemption from inheritance tax on farmland. So they have decided that to impose a 20% inheritance tax rate on all farms valued at over £1 million. This has proven very, very controversial. The government thinks this will only affect 500 properties. The farming industry think it could affect up to 70,000 properties because they think the government has miscalculated the number of farms which are worth over £1 million. It's proving very, very controversial. Well over 10,000 people protested in London on Tuesday morning. And the Conservative Party is opposed to this, Reform UK is opposed to this, and the National Farmers Union and many other rural organisations are talking about mounting even further protests. Some people are even talking about blockades.
And as you said, there's been protests, a huge backlash. What will be the political implications of this decision to impose this sort of inheritance tax on farms valued over £1 million?
So for the time being, the government doesn't look like it's going to U-turn. The Chancellor thinks we need to raise the money everywhere and we need to raise the money for the NHS, and it's only going to raise £500 million per year by 2029. To put that into the wider context, the total British tax take per year is over £800 billion. So this is, less than a tenth of 1% of total tax take, but the government says this is essential for public services, which I'm sure your viewers will realise it doesn't quite match up. It's such a tiny amount of money. But the consequences of this, I think, will be twofold. One, it will mean lots and lots of mid-sized farms will likely have to sell up, or they'll have to sell off large amounts of their land to pay for this. Because you can be a farm of around 200 acres, which I think is probably going to be around 80 hectares, which your viewers will probably know a bit better. And your value of that farm will be around maybe £2 million. But it's highly unlikely you're going to have all the money available to pay that tax bill up front, because as everybody knows, the money in a farm is taken up in the land, in the machinery, in the sheds and the buildings, not in liquid money. So they might well have to sell up their farms, and what will sell their farms, and what will happen is we will have farms which were productive, which were quite large, will have to be made smaller, therefore they're going to be less productive, and we'll have lots and lots of smaller farms which are more likely going to be dependent on subsidies from the government. So that means more public spending instead of a productive business that's able to grow food. Or we will likely see more farms sold off for green projects. So that might be rewilding. It might be more woodlands being planted for carbon offsetting. I'm sure you've noticed around Europe and around America, lots of corporates and airlines and investment funds are buying up farmland and turning it into forests for carbon credits and green offsetting. That might happen as well. Or we might see more farms turned into solar farms too. And also, solar farms get government subsidies and grants to help build them in the first place. So we're taking businesses which could actually, be productive, which are able to grow food, whether that's beef, lamb, wheat for bread, and feed the nation, and instead turn them into small farms which will not be productive and likely take government subsidy. And it won't even avoid tax avoidance, because the government thinks that at the moment, because agricultural property doesn't have inheritance tax, it encourages tax avoidance, because people leave London, where there's high rates of inheritance tax on expensive property, and they buy farmland instead to avoid that tax. That does happen, and I'm not disputing that. And one of the most famous people involved at the moment, Jeremy Clarkson, has admitted he initially bought a farm for this purpose, but now he has turned the farm into an actual enterprise, and that's why he's protesting against the tax, because it's a business that he has built and he cares about. But in reality, they've just changed the threshold to £1 million. So you can still avoid tax by buying farmland below £1 million, and then you can get public subsidies to do rewilding projects or woodland planting or hedgerows or peat bogs restoration and get more public money for it. So the tax avoidance can still happen, and public subsidies are going to be spent on green projects anyway, and the people that really lose out are farmers who want to grow food.
But how is it that the government can claim that the vast majority of farmers will remain unaffected? Is this accurate?
I think it's inaccurate. I think their figures are wrong, and I think they've got them from bad quality research from a very, very left-wing organisation which focuses on redistributive tax policy that basically thinks that inheritance tax should be increased across the board, and they fundamentally don't like farmers and farmland. I think they have miscalculated the fact that the machinery and the equipment comes into the value of the farm. I think they've just looked at raw land value only, and I do genuinely think their figures are wrong. Interestingly, a budget is done by the Treasury in Britain, but we have a government department that oversees farming. The farming department was not told about this tax before the budget, and the farming department has also disputed the number of farms affected. So there's a little bit of inter-government disagreement on this one, but unsurprisingly, the Treasury is much more powerful than the farming department.
And what could be the possible long-term economic consequences for this policy for family farms?
Yep. So I think we'll have much smaller farms, which will be much less productive. So food production in Britain will likely decrease, which I think is sad. We might see some consolidation where some smaller farms get bought up as much bigger operations, much bigger farms. And bigger farms are more productive in Britain, particularly in some parts of the country where there's wheat farms, and the larger the farm, the more you can grow and the better yields. But in reality, I think the opposite will happen. I think we'll have smaller farms which are less productive, and Britain will grow less food. We have imported food in this country for a long time. Britain is used to importing food. Even since the 1830s or 1840s, we have had lots of imports. So imports are a kind of accepted part of our national reality. For example, about 30% of beef in Britain is imported. So we know that imports play an important role, but this will tip the balance, and it might not get to majority, but it will steadily increase, and it will be a very sad day for British farming.
And I understand that Labour are inflexible when it comes to this issue. What are the risks for Labour if they don't become a bit more flexible and listen to the people?
That's a great point. They are inflexible for now. The risks for them is they won a huge number of seats at the general election. They've got over 400 seats. For the first time in Labour's history, they also have 100 seats which represent the countryside. This is very new territory for Labour. They instinctively don't understand how to represent the countryside. Rural people are not their people. Farmers are not really their people. And representing the countryside is not something they're used to. The reason why they won all these seats is because the Conservatives did so badly, and the Conservative voters were so angry that so many of them either stayed at home or voted Reform, that Labour got in by default. So, interestingly, we now have 100 Labour MPs who are very worried about their seats, who are being hammered every day in their inboxes, their post bags, by their constituents, by people in their local areas who are really angry about this. This doesn't make me think there's going to be a U-turn just yet, or at all, but they might dilute it a little bit, because the main thing you can do to get a government to change course is to scare the MPs who make up that government. And right now, we've got lots of new MPs who don't know what it's like being an MP. They've only been there 4 months. They're unused to the whole concept of it. And they are apparently inundated by complaints from farmers.
As a final question, I understand that inheritance tax has been a sort of a continuous issue in the UK, but how does this policy compare to previous governments?
So I think they have maintained inheritance tax on residential property the same for the time being, which is it kicks in at about £325,000. The problem is property values in Britain have got so high that loads more people are paying inheritance tax than ever planned. Another thing they have done is they've got rid of business property relief, which means if you pass down a business to your children after you die, that now also has an inheritance tax on it. So for many farmers, that's a double hit, because lots of farmers have diversified, so they have businesses on their farms. So if you're a farmer that also has a restaurant, in your area, in your farmland, that is now going to be affected with inheritance tax as well. So the inheritance tax burden has increased quite a lot and will be very painful for lots of people. But in the wider context, this is why I'm in favour of abolishing inheritance tax outright. Inheritance tax takes in £7 billion per year. As I said earlier, the total tax take is £800 billion per year. So we're talking about less than 1% of total taxes. It would be far fairer and far more popular to abolish inheritance tax entirely.
Thank you, Fred Defossat, Director of Strategy at Legatum Institute, for being back with RICS Europe.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. See you another time.
And thank you for watching RICS Europe.